see. So welcome all. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our CLS 1200 Fall Series Speaker Series that we have got together with a lot of great scholars to participate in this series with us. And again, thank you all for joining us today. So this is today our talk is Obstinate Transnational Memories, Oral Histories, Shapes of Salvadoran Mexican Subjectivities. And it's the name of a chapter from U.S. Central Americans that, there he goes, there it is, Stephen is holding it up there, that Stephen, wrote a chapter, and this is the name of the chapter that Stephen wrote for us there, right? So should we start with the welcome, Anita, or should we move into the land acknowledgement?
Sure. I'll just say a couple of words. I just wanted to acknowledge my colegas, Profe Dani Topete and Profe Rafa Solorzano. It's been a beautiful journey to be collaborating with you on this series. We are teaching Chicanx Latinx Studies in the Department of Chicana o Latina o Studies at Cal State LA. Our colega Leda Ramos is also here, and maybe some of our other colegas are on. Welcome. And of course, Profe Osuna is also an alumni of this department. So it's just an honor to be with you all. It is a 1200 series, which is an intro class. But one of the things that we did is we collaborated to create a class or classes. Each of us teaches 2 to 4 classes, 2 to 5 classes of a different variety. And we said, we want to bring some connection to our students across these many classes. And so several of you who are on this call with us are part of this collection. And many of you are also part of our upper division classes or our grad classes. So thank you so much for joining us on the 1200 series. But it's just amazing. We've been able to invite scholars that are focused on bringing in voices that are connected to Blackness, for example, to Central American studies, to queer studies, to trans studies, to migration studies, all of these areas that are newer to our field that have been marginalized in Chicanx and Latinx studies for some time, and of course in mainstream studies. And so it's really beautiful to have that space together and just welcome these colegas who are at the cutting edge. So Profe Osuna, thank you, one, for taking the chance on Chicanx Latinx Studies at Cal State LA as a young scholar, and then also for coming back full circle to us and sharing your knowledge today. And then I'll now give the space over to Professor Solorzano to give us the land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I can't believe this is our last speaker in this series. I remember when we were strategizing this back in July and August, right, Daniel? So muchísimas gracias to all our speakers. And thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today. So let us begin. First and foremost, I would like us to take a deep breath as part of our land, labor, and life acknowledgement. As you know, taking these deep breaths allows us to pause and center ourselves, especially if we've had already a hectic day or a hectic week. Each breath reminds us to reconnect with our body. And also, I want to give a special shout out to our colegas at Pan-African Studies and Dr. Melina Abdullah, who crafted some of these statements. And a better way to kind of take a pause during midweek and pay respect to all our relations. If you can all join me, let's take our first deep breath and release. I would like to take notice that we are currently in occupied and stolen territory here in Los Angeles, the ancestral territory of the Tangva and Gabrielino people, the First Nations people of the Los Angeles Basin. I also would like to acknowledge, I would also like for you to acknowledge the occupied territory that you are currently residing on right now. If you like, you can share its indigenous name in the chat box. If you don't know its indigenous name, what I can do is I'm going to drop this link in the chat box and you can look it up. and then you can drop its name. Also, feel free to announce it. We pay respect to all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, to show reverence and to call in their continued presence, to call in their ancestral knowledge within these spaces and institutions, even within these Zoom spaces. So again, let's take another deep breath together and release. We pay homage to those who were stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named as chattel, and forced into labor, who were called slaves, but never submitted as such, who have always been fully human and with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our African ancestors for their still unpaid labor, which built what is now the Americas. And let's all take our last deep breath. To both our Indigenous and African forebears, let us commit to a continued struggle for liberation and reparations, for it is only through freedom and justice that we can truly give honor to all our relatives, to all our relations. Aho Ashe. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafa. Appreciate that. Um, and so as we get ready for Stephen, I would like to Anita, if you could mention the Zoom keeping rules and just kind of what we've been discussing, please.
The Zoom keeping rules?
Mm,
um,
I was
I
like, okay.
Oh, I usually like to always let people know that while you're hearing something via Zoom, feel free to use the reactions, show
Mhm.
people love, show
There
them
it
thumbs
is.
up and
Got it.
clap, right?
Yeah.
Because we're so much not always in the classroom, we don't see that acknowledgement. And so the way we can appreciate Dr. Osuna and for his words is to show him some emotion. So feel free to use those icons.
Ah,
That's
there
right.
it is.
That's right. I
Gracias.
like that.
Thank you.
And of course, love and respect always. Gracias.
So, thank you, thank you. So I'd like to introduce Profe Stephen Osuna. Stephen Osuna is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at California State University, Long Beach. He received his PhD in sociology and the emphasis of Black studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an MA at BA in Chicano Studies at California State University, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the relationship between global and racial capitalism, transnational criminalization, militarization, policing, the social control in US, Mexico, and Central America. Stephen was born and raised in Echo Park, Los Angeles, and he is the son of Mexican and Salvadoran working class migrants. His scholarship has been published in Ethnicities, Policing the Planet, Why Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, The Future of Black Radicalism, US Central Americans Reconstructing Memory, Struggles, and Communities of Resistance, Chiriku Journal, Latino Literatures, Art and Culture, and Race and Class. He is currently a member of board of directors of Homies Unidos Los Angeles and an organizer with Human Rights Alliance for Child Refugees and Families, HRA, and the Philippines U.S. Solidarity Organization in SoCal. And on a personal note, again, I am also a Cal State LA alumni. Stephen and I were around the same time when we were working toward our BA. I had transferred from a community college, a local community college, and Stephen was already a seasoned vet there. And he welcomed some of our cohorts in, showed us the ropes, and it was great to have somebody like that to lean on. In my classes, I'm always stressing, finding that community, right? Finding that community, especially as first generation college students. A lot of times my friends that weren't going to college and things like that were like, hey, let's go study. And they're like, nah, let's go to the club. Yeah, well, while that's important too, it's important to have that community at school. But that doesn't mean me and Steven didn't go to a couple of clubs or concerts either. But, again, it was great to have that community inside and outside of academia. And again, just we even created a GRE study group, which still haunts me to this day. But that's for another day. We'll talk about that. But again, preparing for a PhD program, all of those things, again, having someone like Stephen to lean on, I'm very grateful for. And thank you for that, Stephen. And again, with much, hold on, let me admit this one person. Con mucho orgullo and with a lot of pride, I welcome Stephen Osuna. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you all for inviting me to speak in your classes today. That GRE prep class was a lot, wasn't it? The only word I remember is tortuous.
Oh yeah,
And I don't
and
even know if I'm saying it
chicanery.
right. But anyway, yeah. So thank you all for inviting me again. It's like Alex Villalpando, who's also a professor at Cal State, invited me to speak in his class. I think last week or 2 weeks ago. And I just mentioned that it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to Cal State LA students that are also reading the work that I've written, right? So like the labor I've put into to write this stuff and the labor you're putting into reading it means a lot to me. More so because you're Cal State LA students, right? Any other students could read it across the country, but because Cal State LA students are reading what I've written means the world to me, right? I just wanted to show that instead of having my degrees up on the walls, I have my EOP for high academic achievement in 2000
Nice.
award. I was an EOP special admin at Cal State LA, right? So, you know, Cal State LA means a lot to me. Not the institution, because it's got all its corruptions and contradictions, but the people there, right? The students I met, the faculty I met, right? Just being there with people means a lot to me. It was a second home to me. So yeah, I'm just really happy to be here with y'all. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person, right? We can't be together in person, but at least we're here virtually. I currently live in the Sereno, which is just around this corner from Cal State LA, so it feels like I'm kind of there, right? But again, thank y'all for inviting me to speak on this chapter that I wrote. So just a little background, I guess, to get started, why I wrote this, and I'm gonna start it that way. So just to give, because I don't think that's one thing I didn't do in the book chapter, like put myself into the book and say why did I write this, right? And putting my positionality in it, right? As I mentioned in the bio, my mom is a Mexican migrant from some Mazatlan, Sinaloa, or from a pueblo near Mazatlan, Sinaloa, and my father is from El Salvador, from San Miguel or San Salvador, which is very unknown. He's never really shared with exactly where he's from. I grew up with my mother, our single mom. My dad was in and out of my life, right? Grew up in Echo Park, and growing up in Echo Park was just an interesting place to be in, right? In the 80s and 90s, growing up Salvador Mexican was an interesting thing, right? Because it was a predominantly Mexican community, but there was Central Americans that have historically been there, right? And it was close to a neighborhood of Pico Union, MacArthur Park areas that were also an influx of Central Americans that were arriving due to the wars and state terror in the 80s, right? And economic restructuring in the 90s. But growing up there, you know, again, being Salvadoran Mexican, I was always, you know, didn't understand why people would say like, oh, those Salvadorans, all those Mexicans, right? There's always this like unknown tension that was mentioned but never really understood, right? Because then when you'd ask people, why don't you like this person, it was always a nonsensical reason. Like, oh, I just don't like them because they took my parking space. Oh, I don't like them because they just moved in and I don't like the loud music they play. But they'd always blame it on the ethnicity or the nationality of the person rather than just, I just don't like that one person, right? It became a national ethnic difference that became a problem. Or when it got even more serious, work relations. Well, they just hired this person who's Salvadoran, who's getting paid less than I am. And I've been working really hard to get a certain pay and they're getting a cheaper wage. Right? Or this manager of mine who's this ethnicity is treating me this way, right? Again, these labor relations that could easily have pointed up and say, well, it's maybe your management or maybe the company or maybe, you know, the employer, but it was always the tension between workers, right? That would come out. But again, growing up, I didn't understand that. It was just always just baffled by it because I'm Salvadoran Mexican. I was like, what's wrong with being both? Right? What's wrong with, we look the same. When the LAPD comes and harasses me and my friends, they ain't asking if we're Mexican or Salvadoran. They're putting us all against the wall, right? And so that was an interesting thing to me that to understand. And so when I got to Cal State LA, as I mentioned, I went to Belmont High School, right? I graduated from Belmont High School. I was a special admit. I entered Cal State LA through the back door of the EOP program. You know, here was my opportunity to study these things. I was always interested in history, but LAUSD didn't really teach me history. LAUSD just had a textbook that I had to follow, but really wasn't giving me an understanding of who I am, where I come from, and the conditions that set the terrain of where I am, right? So the Department of Chicano Studies, Latino Studies gave me that, right? But it gave me the perspective of the Chicano experience, right? Not the Central American experience. But what I always say, instead of saying like, oh, they erased it or they neglected it, because that wasn't their role. Their role was to give me a history of the Chicano X experience, and that was fine. But what they did do was give me the frameworks and understanding to understand the Salvadoran experience. They gave me the tools for me to do my own research, my own investigation, right? And it's really fortunate now that we do have spaces that study Central American studies, right? So we don't necessarily have to do it on our own, yeah. So that I'm really appreciative of all the work and labor that people have done. But in my time, I just, you know, in my undergrad, I just figured it out on my own. But also not only through that lens, but through social movements, right? I got involved with organizing the Salvadoran migrants and got to travel to El Salvador for the first time on my own in the 2006 or 2007, right? Where it became more concrete to me that what it was, the experience of Salvadorans, right? And not only just the experience of Salvadorans, but the left experience, like the radical traditions of being Salvadoran. That meant a lot to me, right? Because I already understood the radical experience of being Chicano and Mexican, right? But what it was, the radical leftist experience of being Salvadoran and combining those two things, right? So that was an interesting thing. And I started meeting comrades and friends that also had similar experiences, right? Of coming of age and understanding their situation in Los Angeles in the United States and their relationship to their parents' home countries, right? So all that was in my mind as I was thinking about, okay, well, I was in my BA, my master's, right? So I started a master's in Chicano Studies where I met Dr. Esther Hernandez, who really inspired me to push this research, right? Where she's like, well, if you're interested in studying these two groups, Mexican Salvadorans and their relation to each other, why don't you research it? And before it was just a thought, it wasn't necessarily a research topic, right? It was just something that I just never got understood, right? But she helped me with the tools and the frameworks to analyze and think about them critically, right? So I didn't do the project at Cal State LA. I pursued it during my PhD at UC Santa Barbara for my master's thesis in sociology. And that's where I started studying the relationship between Mexicans and Salvadorans, right? But more so, I found, well, why don't I interview people who are like myself, Salvadoran Mexican, but that actually grew up with both parents, right? That's the difference. I didn't. I grew up with my mom, and I had an in and out relationship with my father and the Salvadoran community. And it wasn't until much later that I really had family, friends, and colleagues that were Salvadoran, right? But I wanted to interview people that had both parents, right, or had a relationship with both parents. And I did that, right? I interviewed 20 people, right, that were predominantly youth, right, between the ages of college age and early mid 20s, right? And I wanted to interview them and ask them like what was their experience growing up being Salvadoran Mexican in Los Angeles, because that's a very particular LA experience, right? Salvador Mexican. That's not. It's not. I don't know if it exists other places, but it's an LA identity, right? I always tell people I'm LA, right? I'm ethnically LA, right? So I interviewed people that were Salvadoran Mexican, and what came out first of all was that what I call a dialectical tension, and so a dialectical relationship, a dialectical interplay of tension and solidarity, right? It's not one or the other. It's not we don't just get along or we get along. It's dialectical, right? They interplay with each other. Why? Because of the experiences of migration, the experiences of labor exploitation, right? The experiences of racialization in this country, right? All those things create hierarchies, right? And it pins groups against each other, right? Not only because so something I was analyzing and learning that it wasn't innate, right? That Mexicans and Salvadorans are innately enemies. No, there was a tension that was developed because of the historical conditions that placed these groups with each other, right? And we had to understand historically what that meant. So this project I wrote, right? I wrote that, but as I was doing these interviews, this chapter came out, right? As I was interviewing these folks, they started talking about knowing their parents' migration experiences, knowing their parents, how they got here, where they worked, how they met, what they left in Mexico and El Salvador, right? And those are the things I was like, wow, that's interesting that they remember these things because they've been told about these stories, and these stories have shaped who they are, right? Unconsciously sometimes too. It wasn't even until the interview process, like, man, I didn't think about this, but yeah, this has really shaped how I do the work I do today. Like, right? Same thing with me. Knowing my mom's migration experience really shaped how I see Mexico in relationship to this country. But then learning about the history of El Salvador really helped me understand my father, right? Despite the fact that me and him had our relationship has been in and out, and I haven't seen him since 2005 now, or 2004. I understand what he left. I understand what he went through, right? I understand the experience he had to deal with when he got here to the United States, right? As a Salvadoran man dealing with the experience of fleeing his country, right? Leaving his family behind, right? So all those things really helped me put these things into context and to develop this article, this book chapter y'all got to read today. Yeah. So when we look at Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles has the largest population of Mexicans and Salvadorans in the United States, right? I think it's if I'm not mistaken, 78% of the Latinx population, 78% are Mexican descendants or Chicano, right? And 9% are Salvadoran. Now you might sound, well, 9% is small. That's still a significant number of Salvadorans in Los Angeles, right? And again, they're the majority of the working class, right? And I want to emphasize that the majority of the working class, meaning that they do all the service work, all the manufacturing work, right? They're highly exploited. Right? A lot of them are undocumented workers or are underemployed or unemployed. Their children and oftentimes themselves are policed and incarcerated. So there's a lot of conditions that shape these communities that then shape their relationships to each other. And I really want to put that and remind us of that, right? That when we think of communities and their relationship to each other, we have to understand the conditions that shape those relationships. And then when we look at the history of these two groups, right, the migration of Mexicans to Los Angeles and the historical relationship of settler colonialism in Los Angeles, right, the history of U.S. intervention in Central America, and specifically El Salvador, right, there's distinct histories to each group. So we can't lump them up, right? So the term Latinx, there's been a huge debate about this term, right, and how dangerous it is because it masks and it hides histories and it hides specificities, right? It's a useful term to unite people, but it has its dangers. It has its contradictions. Like anything, it has its contradictions, right? Especially during these elections, right? The Latino vote, right? This whole thing about the Latino vote, and it's like you can't do that. You can't just say the Latino vote, right? There's complexities, there's regionalisms, there's histories. Even within Mexico, you can't say just Mexican. Right, there's differences within the North and the South and different states and different indigenous communities, right? So I was one thing that came out to me when doing this was that, right, that there's a specificity for each community, right? And it's even more complex than I described it in this, right? It's more complex than that. And one thing that comes out of this research also is the idea of constructing a transnational space, right? The Los Angeles itself is a transnational space, not only of remittances, of culture, of politics, of families, but of memory, right? And that's what I think this chapter is what I wanted to do, talking about this obstinate transnational memory, right? And when I use that word obstinate, it's like something that stays, right? That's with us, it's in us, it's in us, right? And oftentimes, again, we just know snippets of it. We don't know like we don't have a book with a history of our parents, a history of our families, but we know snippets of them, right? And oftentimes they might not even be accurate, but we make meaning of those histories, right? We make meaning and understanding of those things, and that also helps us connect to our parents' home countries, right? Again, my father, I don't know his exact migration story. All I could do is do an understanding of, well, this is why the Salvadorans migrated. This is a bigger picture of it. And my father came at a certain period, must mean he came during this period. Right? That's all I really understand of my father. Right? But learning from the oral histories and experiences of all other compañeras and compañeros from El Salvador really helped me understand that. Same thing with my mom's experience, right? So when I did these interviews, you know, I had to think about frameworks, right? Okay, what are the frameworks that I want to work through in thinking about these interviews? And one thing I, you know, at the time I was reading Antonio Gramsci, who's a communist intellectual from Italy. And one thing he reminded us is that we're all intellectuals. We all have the ability to analyze and interpret the world around us. We might not all have that title, right? But we all have the ability to understand and analyze the conditions around us, right? And I thought that was very important for me when I was doing these interviews, right? Because I wanted, and I mentioned that to the participants, right? That y'all are the ability to think through these ideas, right? And we're gonna have this conversation through this interview. Right? I wanted to understand it through another Italian scholar named Alessandro Portelli. Alessandro Portelli talked about conceptualizing subjectivity as learning people's experiences, right? To not dismiss people's subjectivity or how they see themselves, but try to understand and make meaning of how the people see themselves in history, right? That's very important, right? Oftentimes we deny people how they see themselves, but it's important to see how they see themselves in the context of the conditions around them, right? I want to think about the idea of grasping history to talk about the future, right? To talk about the moment, the present, right? Using it for action, not just to talk about it, right? And then for there, I went to Frantz Fanon, right? He talked about the colonized intellectual, oftentimes grasp history, not just to talk about history, but to use it as something to inspire you to action, to action in the present and the future, right? So all these ideas, and finally, Ana Patricia Rodriguez, who's a Central American Studies scholar, who talked about this idea of secondhand memories, that children of the diaspora oftentimes have what she calls secondhand memories, meaning that their memories pass down, right? And that's really fundamental to what I was writing about, right? That these are memories that not necessarily are yours, are not the participants, but are passed down, right? So this construction of what I call the obstinate transnational memory, right? Memories of social, political, and economic terrain, transnational migrations, and working class experience passed down to the participants, right? This obstinate memory. Yeah? So these again, so as you read, I interviewed a couple of folks, right? 20 participants, and the things they shared on how they shared the gender differences between their parents' migration experiences, the reasons for leaving, right? Whether it be economic reasons in Mexico, whether it be political activism on organizing in El Salvador that they had to leave, right? Whether it be a gendered violence towards their mothers that they had to flee El Salvador, right? Extreme poverty in the rural areas of Mexico, right? All these experiences think that some of the participants knew completely or partially, right? And really, when I was writing this, I was like, you know, if students read this, I would want them then to return back to their family members if they never have, and ask them, you know, well, if you've never known why your parents migrated, if they migrated, you know, why'd you migrate? And one thing that comes out oftentimes in Central American studies and Central America, oftentimes, and a lot of the participants didn't know, right? Because their parents just chose not to share, right? Because there's some experiences that are too heavy to share. As one participant was telling me, like, you know, maybe this was my way, my parents' way of keeping me safe. Like, why are they gonna want to tell me something that they went through that really wasn't something that was traumatic? They didn't want to be triggered by it, right? So it was really interesting and really mind-blowing that some of these participants knew clearly what their parents went through, right? That their parents really wanted to let them know, this is what I went through. And you know, sometimes you think about your family member, your parents, like, I didn't come to this country for you to do this, and then they tell you all the struggles they went through, right? And oftentimes I thought about that. I was like, I wonder if that's the case, because I don't remember. My mom would tell me that all the time, right? That was her way of, you know, I wasn't physically punished. It was more morally and ethically punished, right? Like, I didn't migrate to this country for you to be hanging out in the corner. I was like, oh, dude, like, like, it was kind of like, oh man. So, who knows how they learned these stories? That part I didn't ask, right? I just wanted to know about their stories, right? But again, just to say that this topic, this project did not start with trying to learn people's history and memory. It was more about, why do you think Salvadoran Mexicans don't get along? Very simple statement, right? But this opened up to all these other topics and conversations, which is the beauty of research sometimes, right? Where you have a certain set of questions that you want to ask, but it opens up all these other things. And in this research, that's what it opened up, right? The importance of memory, memory that are passed down, are shared with you, right? And how that, towards the end of the book, what the most important part to me is that it moves them to action, right? It moves them to be politically active in either the community, in community organizations, right? Teaching other students about this topic, right? So I think that for me was stood out, that they politicized those memories, right? That it wasn't, and not only individualized them, they made them collective. They collectivized these memories into community memories of their communities, right? That they use them to act in the world, right? And I wanted to read one quote from Antonio Gramsci that really again shaped this project, right? And it says, "The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory," right? An infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. And that's what I mean. Like, we don't, we're not just born with an inventory of who we are. We oftentimes have to discover ourselves, and it happens in different moments and different times, right? But there's traces of it. And I think that's the part that these interviews were showing, right? That there was traces of their parents' histories and who they were and their subjectivity in Los Angeles, right? And again, this was in the context of Los Angeles, right? This was in the context of the biggest mass mobilization against HR 4437, right, in Los Angeles, mega marches, right? The May Day marches. All this stuff was happening, right? When I was doing the interviews after all that, they were saying like, no, I saw a moment of solidarity where Mexican Salvadorans realized that their enemy was the state, the US state that was trying to deport them and criminalize them, right? So there's moments of convergence, right? And for me, as an intellectual, as academic, as a member of a community, as someone that wants to be part of organizations, is how do we activate that further? Rather than continually produce more conflict, more tension, recognize and see that as a constructive tension, and build solidarity through those tensions, right? Because it's easy to cancel, be like, no, I'm not doing this. It's harder to organize and build solidarity, because solidarity is not a given. You have to build it, right? You have to construct it. You have to deal with it. It's a headache to construct it, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And especially, as I was mentioning, given Los Angeles and the demographics, it's a large segment of the working class that makes the city run, right? That organizes the city. Yet they're the ones that are dealing with, for example, this current moment with COVID, right? With high housing prices, right? I walk down the street from my house here. If I drive down Huntington Drive, there's a houseless encampment that there wasn't before, right? And who's there? It's people that look like me and you, right? And so those are the things that really stand out to me when I was doing this research, and I saw how the participants use their history, their memories of their families' migration to really politicize them into action, and to either defend migrant rights, criminalize youth, right, or just see their day-to-day experiences, right? I could keep talking, but I would love to open it up to questions or comments from the students, especially if you all read it. If you read it and you have comments or anything, I'd love to hear it. That's the part. That's my favorite part, when I hear students tell me what they thought about it, or questions, or how do they make it feel, right? Because obviously, when you oftentimes read, there's a visceral feeling too when you're reading. I hope there is, right? And so yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I'm sure more things will come up, but I'll leave it up there for now.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate that. No, for sure. I mean, I feel like, I've been seeing some of the comments there, and folks are resonating with feelings of, growing up in these spaces, especially, as a, disenfranchised community or what have you, or discriminated or racialized community. And I think it's important for us to really recognize what narratives are available for us, right? And how do we access them, right? And I love that the infinite traces but no inventory, right? And again, there's these moments at times that I'll see something, right? Or especially as in my youth, I would hear a song or I would watch a video and it was like, oh, whoa, 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 this is it, right? This is what I was looking for, right? And then you start building your own inventory in these moments that, again, these spaces do not allow, right? And I appreciate you talking about that.
Yeah. No, that's the part. I really recommend that one book. I'll type it in the chat about Alessandro Portelli, right? And his oral history interviews. And he talked about that, right? That sometimes even like your parents sent after work, like your father, like I remember that, like my dad coming to visit me as a plumber and him smelling like the plumbing tools that he used.
Yeah.
And right, that sense, what did that scent mean to you at that moment, right? And that's like that's a working class sense. It's like the workers, that's a worker's sense, right? And how does that influence you? How does that shape you, right? And so, and he writes about that in that book. And I remember writing that. And one of the interviews I mentioned is one of the participants going to work with his mom as a seamstress, right, in downtown LA, right? And him remembering the heat, and remembering getting up early and having to go with her because she didn't have a babysitter, so she had to go take him with her, right? And walking down the street, and then just feeling the heat and just feeling that, and he remembers that, right? And also remembers the stories that his mom would tell him about El Salvador, right? So like all these things shaped who he was today, right?
Definitely. Yeah, just a quick, it just reminded me, like, I remember my dad bringing burritos wrapped in foil in the thing, and it was the best thing ever. I remember one day I told him, like, I want to be a construction worker so I could eat burritos with you. And he's like, no, if you're gonna be a construction worker, you're gonna be the foreman, you're gonna be the architect, you're gonna be. I'm like, oh geez, here we go, right? I didn't come, like you said, I didn't come to this country so you could do the same thing.
Yeah.
So okay, I don't want to take over the whole time, but
If I could jump in.
yes, please.
So Dr. Osuna, thank you so much for sharing about your chapter. I'm wondering if, I put in the chat, if students had questions that they can, write up their questions in the chat, or perhaps they can jump in. So dear students, this is your space. This is like your one-on-one time with Dr. Osuna, and he's here for you. This is an intimate space, so please use it. But I don't know if you know this, Stephen, but our students are right now in our classes, in Daniel's class and Anita's class, working on their final projects. And much of these final projects are collecting these testimonials, these oral histories from their loved ones. I could tell you just from my class, majority of them are interviewing tios, tias, grandparents, moms and dads. And so much of what you had to say, I bet you right now is resonating with them. And what is, and you started kind of sharing some of the tips, but what's some guidance you can give them through this process, especially as they, after they do the interview, try to make meaning after the stories that they've just heard? Perhaps maybe even first-time stories.
Yeah. Well, first of all, sit with it, right? I think that's an important feeling, right? Oftentimes we don't sit with things. We obviously, because it's an assignment, you have to hurry up and finish it up, and it's an assignment you have to turn into your professors. But I get that aspect of it. That's the bureaucratic grading aspect of it. But it's a story that your loved ones or whoever shared it with you. So there's meaning to that. So I really want you to sit with it, right? Read it to yourself and sit with it for a while, right? And obviously, again, I know deadlines exist, right? So you can't sit with it for too long. But enough to sit with it and try to understand, okay, what is it that they shared with you, right? What was it that they shared with you? What was impactful to you? And when I remember when I was interviewing, obviously I had a little notepad, right? And also something that took note of was their emotion, their reactions to things, right? It wasn't just their story, but how they were reacting to what they were sharing, right? That was an important aspect too, right? To be sharing that, right? So I think that's one element, right? Another part, why my partner's gonna walk by with her baby on. We have a 6-week-old in the house. So I'm currently on parental leave right now. So anyway, but yeah. So again, the interview, right? Reading it over yourself, seeing what it is. Now it's only one interview or 2 interviews that y'all did, right? So you necessarily don't need to be. I don't think you could code for the meaning code and like figure out what are the themes that come out of it, right? But for me, the most important part before that was taking your time with the interview, right? I actually do this project with my students too. I teach a sociology of migration and immigration class, and I also have them interview folks, right? Interview folks that have migrated, right, and their experiences of migration. And oftentimes for some of these folks that are interviewed, this is their first time sharing, right? And that in itself is very powerful. And that you have to honor. That this is the first time that they actually shared with somebody their experience. Whether it be because they didn't want to share or no one's ever asked them, it could be multiple reasons why they've never shared. But here is their chance to share with you. So you are also, it's an honor for you to hear that story and to take that story. And now the next part is, how are you going to honor it? Well, by writing about it, right? That's one of the element of it, right? Telling, how do you connect it to the concepts and frameworks that you've learned in your class? I'm sure you've learned a lot of concepts and frameworks to think about, theories that could connect to the experiences of the interviewees, right? Or the people you've interviewed, and more so if it's a family member, think about that. It's an oral history of your family member. You're gonna have, and you could collect for a while, for sure, for years to come. I have students that have interviewed great grandparents, and they're like, I have their story now. This story I could keep, and I know Lela knows about this, about keeping, archiving history, right? Archiving moments, and so I think that is another element that I think y'all to think about, right? How do you not only use this? Obviously, this is for an assignment for your class, but this is something you're going to keep, right? Beyond the class, right? It's something that could also influence how you all see your family and your community, right? And potentially share it once they feel okay with it. Another element I would add is share it with them, right? If you're gonna transcribe it, share what you transcribed, right? Share what you transcribed. There goes Maceo. Our baby's name is Maceo. He just passed by. Maceo and Rose. So yeah, share with them if you have the time, right? Share what the interview. But also share what you wrote, right? Now, if you write it in English and they don't speak English, I wouldn't say, okay, translate it. You could do that if you have the time to do that, but maybe read it with them. This is what I wrote, right? And share what you wrote, but try to translate it, interpret it to them. Right? That's something I wish I would have done, right? Mm-hmm. I was, I've shared this with the participants. They have synonyms, not synonyms, pseudonyms in the book, so there's not their real names. But I've shared it with them. This is what came out of the interview, right? But as for you, if you have a direct still relationship with the person you interviewed, share it with them. I'm sure they'd love to read it, right? Again, it's for you. It might be just an assignment for a class, but it has meaning, right? And I always remind that to students, that whatever you're writing for your classes, keep it, right? Archive it. Because a few years later, you're going to read it again and be like, wow, that's what I was thinking at the time. I'm almost like a diary, right? That's what I was analyzing at the moment, right? Because again, the historical conditions of the moment are going to shape how you write this, how you're thinking about this. Like I'm thinking like maybe, 10, 20 years from now, when I read this article y'all read, this chapter, I'm probably going to think very different about it. Right? I'm going to see it very differently, right? Because it was going to be a different moment in my life. So I would say that, right? Keep that. So again, take your time, right? Think through the ideas and frameworks you've learned from your professors. Share it with the people you've interviewed, right? Share the transcripts and the actual what you write, right? And again, if they can't read it, sit with them, right? And if you can't sit with them because of Zoom, well, Zoom with them or FaceTime with them, right? There's other ways now, yeah. And my mom FaceTimes with me, so yeah, so you know, we can do it that way, right? So yeah. But any questions? Any questions y'all have? I would really enjoy it. Any comments? It doesn't have to be a question. It could be just be a comment.
Saludos, Stephen.
Thank you.
This is Anita talking. I'm still waiting for the shy students to speak up. I think they got shy because you said, especially if you read it, and then they're like, oh, I'm not gonna say anything.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't have to have read it. You can
Yeah, you don't
you
have
can
to have
just
read
say
it.
something.
No, you don't. Yeah.
I'm just gonna right now
All right,
drop
awesome. Jessica and Brian have comments. And don't speak to this right now, Stephen, but I do want to say and honor. Well, first I want to honor Maceo and Rose for for sharing you and your time with us. That's really beautiful that they are willing to share you with us. So thank you. And then I also want to say that there's a healing aspect to the work that you did. I think the compassion that you're having for your father is coming through very clearly. And then also the compassion, from Mexicano to Salvadoreño to Mexicano is really there. And I know one of the students spoke about having that conflict in her own family, being made to feel bad about being, half and half.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to hear from Jessica and then Brian, and then maybe you can speak to my comment later.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say how much your work resonated with me right now, currently, as I was hearing you speak. That's kind of something I want to approach as my thesis. And so I just wanted to share really quickly because I feel like your work really kind of centered what I want to do. And so I was raised in a church that's half Salvadorian, half Mexican. And so what I've tried to do in the past are healing circles where we talk about their journeys to the US, right? And so you feel that tension. And so I've learned to kind of separate them whenever we want to have healing circles. But recently, when my mom passed away, I felt a sense of love from these Salvadorian women. And they took me in as a child. So I feel like semi-adopted, even though I don't have the roots, right? And so as you were speaking, right, like that's what I want to do. I want to be able to honor them and kind of center my work around them just because I know that they've been through so much, right? And the experience that they have as women traveling through Mexico, I feel like it's such a strong narrative that can't be shared sometimes just because it gets so much pushback, right? And so I just wanted to thank you for the work that you do and kind of like this helps me navigate where I want to go with my thesis. And I'm amazed at the work that you do.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. You know, that's and you have a site to explore, right? The church. Whatever our relationship to religion might be, it's the symbolism, the power of that building community, and the fact that you have these two communities there to try to work with and understand is powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's what that. I think it's in my experience of writing this stuff and researching and just living in in my communities, right? I think the experience of Central Americans crossing through Mexico is a wicked one, and I say wicked because of the state terror, right, and the violence that Central Americans have to go through while traveling through the state of Mexico. It's like a middle passage almost in a way, right? And people have focused on it recently because it's an extension of the U.S. border, but it's more than just the extension of the U.S. border. It's the Mexican state itself, right? And it's a state, it's a capitalist state at war with its own people, right? The Mexican state is at war with its own community. The Mexican people have been dealing with a dirty war, or quote unquote the war on drugs, for a very long time. So if the Mexican state is killing its own people, how's it going to treat migrants crossing through Mexico, right? And I always emphasize that, right? Because we fall back into individualizing experience and be, oh, well, this Mexican said this Salvadoran said that, so that's why they don't get along. Nah, dude, it's structural, No, and I think you pointing to that is a very powerful experience of Salvadoran women migrating through Mexico, right? And honoring that. And not just honoring that, understanding the root causes of why they even migrated in the first place, right? Going back to El Salvador, why are they leaving El Salvador? Why are they leaving Central America? And you know, and right now, just with what's happening in Central America with climate change, right? We're not, you know, we shouldn't be surprised if we see new caravans and exoduses of migrants coming. And what are we going to do, right, to support them and build solidarity in Mexico with these communities, right? Because there's, you know, I was in Mexico in 2018. Was it 2018? In Mexico City, was it? I think it was 2018, Mexico City, when the first like caravans were coming, right? And I was there when the first one of them arrived in Mexico City, and it was interesting to see how some Mexicans really took it upon themselves to support the migrants, right? Because they saw the solidarity, but that's because they had their analysis of the bigger problem, right? The analysis that the root cause is not migrants. The root cause is this political economic system that's leaving a lot of us behind, right? This global capitalist system that's right now in crisis, and it's becoming fascist throughout the world, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in India, and here in the US, right? And so when you put that in the larger context, you see these communities dealing with each other and having to figure out their experiences. So I really appreciate that you're doing this work, right? That you're trying to bring together communities rather than just continue the narrative of separating, right? Right? Differences are exploited. Differences are used to oppress. Let's build from those differences rather than exploit the differences, you know? And I think that's what you're doing, and I really appreciate that.
Gracias. Brian, did you want to make your comment? Brian Ruiz?
Yeah, do I have to show myself, or am I good with the audio?
You're fine with audio.
Good.
Okay. You know, when I was reading your chapter, it's like it resonated with me because I am part Salvadorian and part Mexican myself. And growing up, a majority of the people within the apartment complex that I lived in were Salvadorian. But then at school, a majority of the kids were Mexican. So, you know, even from the kids back in elementary school, you know, they would make fun of me because they'd be like, oh, you know, you're half Salvadorian, you know, like Salvadorian are really bad people. And I'm just here like, how are Salvadorians bad people if all of the Salvadorians that I'm around are like really generous and like heartfelt with the way that they interact with the community? And then it's like growing up, I still saw a lot of that. And then like you mentioned, where it's like, it's not necessarily based on anything aside from, oh, you know, like you just can't stand a certain person because of what they did, not because of their nationality. And so, you know, due to a lot of that conflict that I grew up around of like, oh, you know, you're Salvadorian, Salvadorians are bad, I entirely disconnected from my Mexican identity. It's like for the longest time, I chose not to identify as Mexican because I wanted to prove to people that Salvadorians are not bad people. And it wasn't until I believe like junior year of high school, which at this point was like 9 years ago now, that one of my professors offered a Chicanos class. You know, it was a 2-part class. The first semester was, you know, analyzing and studying the native people of Latin America. And then the second part of the semester was understanding the richness of the Chicano culture and the impact that it had here in the US. It was like that made me reconnect to my Mexican side. And it was just like, you know, it's not based on how much you hate someone, but it's based on how much you're willing to learn and acknowledge about them. So, you know, once I started taking the class, it's like I did my own research. I was like trying to understand why it was that my mom came here and why it was that my dad came here. But unfortunately, since I don't have that great of a connection with my father. Like, I don't know as much aside from who my grandmother was, and that, you know, she was the one that pushed him to come here to the US. As opposed to my mom, where it's like, she came here 2 years prior to the Civil War breaking out in El Salvador. And the reason why she came over was that she wanted to have a method of providing and supporting her family back home. And then, so that was part of my first comment. And then part of the second comment is relating to the interviews that we've had to do. For my particular interview, you know, I had assignment like this similar about like 4 years ago. And I chose to interview someone that I considered my grandmother, because she started taking care of me since I was 7 days old. And, you know, she was this like really sweet old Salvadorian woman. And reason why I chose to like focus the interview on her was because I would see her own grandchildren, you know, like push her aside. They're just like, oh, you know, you're just old. You just want to talk to someone. And that really bothered me. So I sat down and I had about a 3-hour interview with her. And I learned so much about not just her, but also the culture in El Salvador back in the 60s and the 70s. And it's like, you know, the reason why she chose to flee from El Salvador was because Civil War was breaking out. Like, she ended up fleeing like 2 years into the Civil War. So she had herself as well as her 3 nephews with her. And, you know, she told me, she's like, we had to dodge gunfire shots. We had to pay off people to let us pass through a certain village. And this is all from them leaving El Salvador and all the way through Mexico. And so, you know, one of the biggest things, like you said, was that if you're doing these interviews, make sure that you sit on it, because once you go back and you transcribe it, you're going to start to pick up on like little details that you missed while doing the verbal questioning. And, you know, it's really important because you're not just recording these interviews or writing them down, but you're interacting with history. And it's this history that makes up not just who we are, but who the future generations will be. Because we're passing on their knowledge, we're passing on their struggles. And it's a great way to not only like memorialize them, but also, you know, use them as a guiding tool as to what we should avoid going further. So for anyone else that like is working on their final projects, if you are going to do the interview, make sure you do it with someone that you particularly really care about and someone that you're willing to learn about. Because I put off writing her interview from 4 years ago until this semester, because it hurt a lot learning all the struggles that she had to go through. And just like listening to it back now, it like reminded me of how much she went through, but not just that, but like how much I appreciate the fact that she went through that, because she was able to come here to the US and raise several generations of kids that weren't even her own. And she impacted each and every single one of us in a different way.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. You want to respond?
Yeah, that was really powerful. And I think that you know, that sets it up for all of y'all to work on this, you know. Brian, thank you for sharing that. You know, I had to sit with that, you know, that what you just mentioned. You know, I think in you know, the process of like you said, like you're passing down these histories, these stories, right? Stories of people that mean something to you, you know, and the fact that, you know, you've had this story for 4 years and you're just going to do it now. I think willing, you know, and like I said, willing to listen and willing to learn, you know, I think that's powerful, you know, and that's something that I think in my work was what I was trying to show, right? That if we just actually sat down with each other and organized with each other and built community with each other, we realized that there's a lot of things that we're dealing with that we could actually win and challenge if we were organized together, right? Rather than dividing ourselves, because this is simple divide and conquer, right? Audre Lorde talked about divide and conquer being a tool of the oppressors, right? And we embody that sometimes. We internalize those feelings of divide and conquer. And as Brian, you're just sharing, right, that you yourself, you grew up in a community of Salvadorans, but then when you went to school, it was probably Mexicans, and this treatment. I remember those treatments. And I think it takes a lot for us to then move beyond that and learn and say, okay, well, I understand where this is coming from, and I understand the history of what's developed this, and then act on that, right? And then that's the hard part, because it's easy just to sit with it and be like, whatever, we just don't get along. But we can't. We need to organize our communities. Our communities are under attack, and so learning from our communities and learning and sitting with it, like you said, willing to listen and willing to learn from each other is powerful, and so yeah, thank you for sharing that part. Man, Cal State LA students, telling y'all.
Gracias so much, Stephen. We want to make sure and honor your time. It's 1:34 and we're out of time.
Okay.
So we want to thank all the students and make sure you can, exit out now. But before we go, I just want to say some word of thanks. I want to thank, Stephen. I want to thank our ancestors. I want to thank Stephen's ancestors from El Salvador, from Mexico. I want to thank your parents, your mother, your father, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your academic teachers, your community teachers, your homies from Echo Park, your siblings, your tenderness, your vulnerability, your resilience, the people who have taught you gratitude, joy, empathy, and compassion. I want to ask for protection and abundance for Maceo, for Rose, and I want to ask for protection for your life as a scholar and an activist. And I want to thank you for all the words and wisdom you shared with us today. Abrazos y gratitude for the following holidays that come your way. Please don't leave us. We want to take a quick picture if you don't mind.
No, yeah, sure.
Okay. So I'm going to take one quick one where you're the center stage, and then I'm going to take another one. If students want to come on and turn on their screens, you're welcome to. 1, 2, 3. Okay, otro más. 1, 2, 3. Gracias to everyone. Love and gratitude. Cuídense.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate you all.
Bye-bye.
Insane.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Hey, y'all, I have to head out to class. Well, Zoom class.
Ándale,
So,
enjoy your
thank you so
Zoom
much.
class.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafa.
Cuídate.
Reina wants to say hi. Hold
No,
on.
I know.
Oh.
Reina.
From the living room having class, and I'm like, that's Brian.
Reina.
Oh, give the big hugs from me.
Take care. Well, I know Rafa left, but let's take a picture of us anyway. That way he learns.
Yeah.
Exactly. 1, 2, 3. Gracias, Stephen. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Loved it.
Yeah, anytime. Again, for Cal State LA, anytime.
Yeah, we'll be inviting you back. Don't worry.
Yeah,
After
of
the
course.
Rona, we're going to get you on campus too.
Okay.
All right. Cuídate.
All right.
We'll send you an
Bye.
email.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'll text you in a bit, Steven, about if you need me for anything. We'll split the emails with the other stuff. All right, pues. Thank you. Appreciate y'all.